Hello and welcome to the Sales Leaders series. I'm your host, Freddie, where I'll be gathering B2B SaaS sales leaders from across the world to answer 5 short, topical B2B SaaS sales questions. These questions are going to be the same each week, bar one, giving you insight and different perspectives into how top performers within the industry think, as well as actionable advice you guys can use in your own selling careers. This week on the show, I'm speaking with Volker Ballueder. Volker has a wide-ranging and rich background in sales, tech, marketing, and consulting. Volker started his career on the front lines in telesales, hitting bones and exceeding quota. He then moved into management roles at multiple tech companies in director and VP roles, having proved his success in leading teams in companies like WebCertain, Dataxu, Rocketfuel, Dentsu, and 4C Insights. Shortly after, Volker founded Ballueder Partners, a sales coaching and consultancy firm helping tech SaaS firms build and implement successful go-to-market and marketing strategies. Since Volker has been within fractional CRO and VP roles with a proven track record of accelerating sales and enhancing business development functions. He's also a best-selling author of Principles for Success, a book summarizing key principles for success in life and business, and the host of the Man Up, Man Down show podcast. Volker, thanks so much for joining me. That was a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Well, look, I've been excited to have this conversation with you, Volker, because your rich background in multiple different companies. I always find it interesting when we get those that have been in SaaS and sales in multiple different companies, because there's so much that we could kind of chat about. So I think it'd make most sense of all the places that we could start this conversation, having been in leadership roles across multiple different firms as an interim and for your own consultancy firm. I'd imagine that you've ran into and had to advise on many fires. Thinking specifically over, say, the last year, and obviously any other kind of experiences that you want to pull into that might be relevant. Are there any consistencies across the firms you've worked with, problems they've run into? If so, what are they, and how would you advise others on overcoming them?
It depends. It always depends, right? There's never a straightforward answer, right, in these things. And as you say, right, whether you work as a consultant, you work interim, you work fractional, right, or in advisory roles, which I do a lot with start and scale ups as well. I mean, one thing, especially with smaller companies, it's usually the owner manager, right? For better or for worse, it's, you have, the owner manager controls everything, right? So if the owner manager is not on board, what you want to do as a sales, if I say person, sales advisor, whichever facility you're working with in business, that's always the biggest challenge you have, right? And it's all, fans and faults with the owner manager. So yeah, it's probably the biggest challenge I see, right? The owner manager. But if the owner manager is, is this, and I talked about that recently in a webinar, it's kind of aligning the goals of the company, his or her vision, right? And then trickles it down. It's almost like if you mention OKRs, right? As it goes through an organization. If you take the vision of the entrepreneur and it trickles down to the organization, the team is on board. That's when, companies really come to life. And that's when you can really work with them because they're all on board. They all, have the same direction of travel, and then you can align them, when it comes to sales processes, marketing processes, success processes, product development, etc., etc. But yeah, I think that's probably one of the key learnings, which is probably not new. So it's probably not rocket science. And the other thing is process, right? I mean, generally speaking, and that doesn't matter if it's a smaller or larger company, particularly when we look at sales, right? People keep forgetting, right? Or whether it's, the medic, spin selling, challenger sales, you name it. You have to develop or adopt or develop your own methodology, right? You have to have a methodology that you really work with and then build a process around that. So everyone is kind of like doing the same on board, gets the same training and also. So I think that's probably the 2 key learnings.
Makes sense. When you mentioned about the owner manager disconnect, I mean, why do you see that happening in most cases?
So it's often because if you're a founder, your mind works differently, it goes at 1,000,000 miles an hour. You know where you're going, right? But you might not communicate it to everyone. Everything is very, very clear in your head where you want to go, right? But you might have communicated to other people, or it's not clear. And that's often the disconnect. And that's why, I always think that the better owner managers, and I don't want to offend anyone here, are the technical ones, because they might go like, I have this technical vision, I have the product vision. I now hand over to a commercial leader, to someone who's done it before, right? To actually run the company. So whether you hire an MD or CEO, or you get another co-founder in, because then that product vision and the company vision sits within the, say, technical department, whilst you have someone else who just runs the whole commercials, operations, etc. And that person can really focus on the product development. But sometimes when you have a more commercial founder, it's sometimes a bigger challenge, either because they're not technical enough to really develop the product. So I've seen that, or they're not the greatest communicator, and they just, as they go 1,000,000 miles an hour, start selling stuff that you can't deliver, or getting involved everywhere. And then, it can be a mess. But that's what I love doing, right? That's why I love to come into these companies and help them, right? Because, I can, depending on who it is, I can either advise in terms of how to go to market, I can advise on, how to communicate with the team, how to structure the team. And there are always nuances. And yeah, that's what I enjoy. It's fun.
I bet. I bet. Amazing. And thinking about your consultancy firm, I mean, what is the type of organization, thinking more so size, that
Yeah.
you really get excited about kind of joining? And what sort of stage would that be?
Again, the answer depends, but, but, as you just said, what is my ICP, right? Which companies do I want to talk to? And it's so important for any company to define this ICP, and which of course I've done for myself, right? Because, you do what you preach. So eventually I like start scale ups, right? When you start to see the first revenue, when you start building the sales team, when you start building, the commercial team, when you get marketing involved, when you build client success out, that's kind of like when I like to get involved. And then I like to see it through, I think, just before Series A. I mean, sometimes Series A, early Series A is still, a sweet spot for me as well. That's kind of, you got your first seed funding through the door, you really want to scale the organization. That's when it's most fun, I think, because you also pivot during that time quite a lot, right? Or most companies do. They go to market, they get market feedback, might not 100% sit within the market. They refine it. They decide, what is their ICP, they can refining their ICP, and, you can build things, that's what I enjoy doing. I enjoy building things. And that's why at the moment I'm focusing a lot on sales coaching. And again, these organizations, I say up to probably 200 people. So sales teams of around about, I say 10 to 15, where I go in and coach those in methodologies. I coach, to training sessions. I do cohort sessions, and help them to adopt the right behavior in sales. Right. So they might be a little bit bigger than, your startups, because of, the sales team is 10 to 15. So they might just be Series A. And that's a fun stage too, because that's when you really go into the weeds and really define, how you sell to the market, and which methodologies you use. And, whoever reads my newsletter, I'm a big, let's say, advocate, and have a keen interest in revenue intelligence platforms at the moment. So, because, they weren't around when I had sales leadership positions in the past, right? And once of a sudden you get all these informations out where you get like, oh, brilliant, I can now see where's the deal, where in the process is the deal, where, what has the sales rep been doing, right? Where does the sales rep need help? Where do they need training? Where do they need coaching? How can you support them better? And getting these actionable insights out that, you don't get out of the CRM is super valuable.
Mm. Fantastic. Yeah. And for anyone listening, just as a quick side note, we'll have a bunch of links, including where you can find Volker's newsletter,
Thank you.
under wherever you're listening or watching this podcast. Taking a bit of a pivot and towards the
Yeah.
previous series, and having written your book about that, where interviewed a bunch of high achievers in all sorts of different realms on success and leadership. Yeah, if you had to name one, has there been a bit of advice that you'd learned from interviewing these individuals and these top performers that stood out to you in your own work and life? And, what was that?
There are lots, right? I mean, I deliberately, I have the copy here. So, they're almost 20 principles, right? And I always look at them and sometimes to say review them and say, serendipity. I remember, Capricorn was the one talking about serendipity and success. Having EQ or growth mindset, are super important. But if you would ask me if I did one episode that really stuck out where I think it probably personally impacted me, but then also hopefully lots of listeners, was Pascal Finet, who talked about the bright sparks, and I think it was my fifth podcast, so I recorded really, really early on. And he said, Volker, you the way your brain works, right? Whenever there are bright sparks, things you're positive about, things that are really helping you to move forward. That's what you need to focus on. And when you learn that, it propels you forward and it propels you forward. And essentially what he described is a growth mindset, a positive mindset, right? In his own words. But that really stuck out to me because it's about this positive thinking you need to have. And, again, whether you're an entrepreneur, you work for yourself or you're working for a company, it's so easy. And, I say that in a lot of, coaching sessions or when I hold webinars on limiting beliefs, for instance, we often, we go like, and we're recording this obviously, in the summer. And often salespeople go like, oh, in the summer, there's nothing to do, right? I can't prospect, and they're going into this downward spiral, telling themselves, the storytelling mind just tells yourself, oh, there's nothing to do. I can't close deals. But instead, it always starts with self-awareness. Once you start having that awareness, well, like, what am I telling myself? I need to change the storytelling. I need to look at the positive things, right? Now is the time to build better relationship with my customers because they have time to listen to me. Now I can take them out for lunch because they're less busy with internal stuff. Now is the time to go for pints, right? And enjoy the sunshine with my client. And, it's like you define what you tell yourself and that's literally the underlying principle. So I think it's a huge success factor, right? And again, if we talk about entrepreneurs earlier, it's what entrepreneurs have. They always have this positive mindset, like things will always work out, right? We always move forward, we always change the product, and not everyone has, right?
Yeah, it's somewhat similar to like the mindset of Carol Dweck, I think,
Yeah.
wrote about this in her book as well. And I mean, it's interesting. I mean, how much do you feel that is on the onus of, say, those salespeople, specifically thinking about the salespeople and the sales team in those situations? How much onus is on them versus, say, the EQ of a sales leader and understanding that this is this is my responsibility? I mean, how would you manage that and kind of, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah. So my opinion is I mean, very selfishly, I would say it's a sales manager that needs to have that mindset and they showcase that mindset, lives that mindset. However, you need to remember that most sales managers are too busy doing it, right? So they might be doing it, they might be showing it, but then they can't teach other people because they're so busy, right? Because they're the player coach. That's the typical role, right? That's their own quota to fulfill and the team's quota. But that's where sales coaches come in, right? That's the obvious pitch from my end, right? That's where people like myself come in and work with those leaders and go like, okay, how do you want your team to perform? Obviously everyone wants them to perform better, but when there's a shortfalls, what should we be looking at? Like what can we coach them on? Because it's all well and good that you do, I don't know, a day's training on, let's say, spin selling, right? And you go like, oh yeah, spin selling. No, now we know the principle. And then you leave it and no one implements, right? But then if you go consistently in every week or, at least once a month and go like, okay, how did you implement spin selling? Can you give me an example, right? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? You do that alongside, a sales manager that is very committed and that's going to work, right? And you can coach the sales manager as well in terms of, how to, I say lead the team and everything else. And that's important. That's where I see so much need at the moment when I look at organizations, but particularly with, if I say the current economy and the current macroeconomic situation, right? Where people are like, oh, we don't know, are people investing? Are people buying? And you constantly need to reevaluate and help the sales team to push themselves forward, right? They need some motivation.
Completely agree on that. I mean, thinking about, and this is going to take a slight turn here, more so specific to you. Now, I mean, think about your own experience in sales, being in those roles
Yeah.
yourself. and as both as a, salesperson and manager,
Yeah.
and then obviously, what you do now. And you can be specific as you want on this answer. What has been your toughest moment in your career if you had to choose one? And how have you dealt with that? Not necessarily to help others avoid those same pitfalls, but to better deal with them.
Oh, that's a good one. Trying to think which one comes first to mind, but I mean, this sales strategy, you come across so many different situations, right? I mean, it's if I say from personal experience, any deal that didn't close, right? The deals you had in the pipeline for ages, and you keep postponing, going like, yeah, it's going to come in, it's going to come in, and then it never comes in. And I recently read, a good friend of mine recommended me a book called The Jolt Effect. So definitely recommend that, about indecision and everything else. It's a great read. And if I'd read it 10 years ago, would have helped me a lot in my career. But we also hang on to these conversations, right? And with clients that constantly postpone rather than having that open conversation, where like, how can I make it happen, right? What else do you need? You don't need a tense reference from another client, because there's clearly something else that's going on. So those are the frustrating moments, right? You look back on and saying, you work for years on a deal and, finally comes through and you're like, that these are the positive moments. But then as a sales manager, you have salespeople, which, some are really frustrating, right? I mean, I had cases where I have to be careful because, I mean, it's a few years ago, but, where people actually didn't perform, right? Or perform because they were doing other things on the side that got them sales in. And, if it's the non-ethical sales and you go like, you can't tolerate that. You have to have those conversations and you need to, remove those people, right? Because they're toxic for an organization. Or you have people that just do their own thing and don't think of anyone else, which is also not great, right? So you have to have the good mix between team players and, commitment and, ethical standards as well. I mean, we all know reputations from sales, like, oh, yeah, the typical casting first. And technical knowledge, particularly for tech and SaaS companies where I spend most of my career. You can't, let's say people go out there and have not a clue how the technology works and then pretending to the client how the technology works. That's the worst thing ever, right? It's, it's like, I don't know, let's say a used car salesperson, right? Trying to tell you how the car works, although it doesn't have a clue, right? It tells you, I don't know, you have to press the left pedal to speed up and that doesn't know how to drive essentially, right? Left pedal for accelerating, right one to stop. And it's not going to work because you can't build the trust in with your target audience. I think those are things that, they're small things, but they're so important when you start hiring people. And then attitude, for people is so important. I have a coach here at the moment, which I think has a great attitude, in terms of self-learning, constantly pushing yourself forward because they want to win, right? And these are the guys you want to hire, guys and girls, right? And you want to hire and you want to coach them, obviously, but you want to support them as a manager as well. You want to mentor them because they have a career in front of them. And that's what I always enjoyed. And that's why I'm now doing what I'm doing because I enjoy, essentially it's helping and supporting people, putting them.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think that's almost, I mean, it's always been important for a sales role, but it's particularly in this, I think the last 9 to 6 months, where I think salespeople have had to become more consultative in their approach as an expert opinion for their product and for their service. Because ultimately, a lot of these products are services in a way. There is change management that has to occur. And I think that's become even more important. But I appreciate you expanding on that. Switching up now, you have worked in multiple different roles, interestingly, across sales and marketing and RevOps and as well as client success over the last 20 years, which I found very interesting. This range, I wonder, was that a conscious choice? And is there anything that you've learned from just having that breadth of a business that's helped you going forward, specifically thinking about sales?
It's yes and no. Let's put it this way. I think about if I ask you, what you're going to be doing in 5 years' time, you're going to no idea, right? And I wasn't different. I didn't start out my career going like I'm going to be CRO. I always wanted to be CEO, right? And in that sense, I achieved my goal by becoming self-employed because self-employed, which also means titles become less and less important. They always wanted to work more as a consultant than I wanted to work in sales. So when I finished my degrees, that kind of like, was a predicted path. And I just ended up in sales. And, quite frankly, that was the first job I kind of could find. And I enjoyed it. I loved it. I fell in love with it. People still laugh at me when they go like, what you enjoyed 100 calls a day, and then 2 hours call time, but it gave me a buzz, right? I mean, it lasted for about 18 months, but it wasn't 18 months. It was fun. We had a great team. We had a great time. We were young-ish, so it was good times. And then as you move through the ranks, you never quite know where you end up. And so I had the chance to move more into a client success role a few years ago. And so I worked agency side more on digital transformation and technology consulting essentially. And I started to enjoy that a bit more, not because, partly there was less revenue pressure, but there was still revenue pressure, if that makes sense. But it was a slight different angle. So it was about, as part of a management team at Rocketfuel back in the days, my task was to essentially make the analysts and the tech people more commercially savvy, right? Essentially coaching them, to understand that the work they're doing is so important in order to win more revenue for Rocketfuel then to do better, which, as we all know, never happened and wasn't my team's fault. I think there was a lot of other things that were wrong at Rocketfuel at the time, which was a bit of a shame because it was a great team and again, we did a cracking job. Just, I like to use that as an example where an analyst came to me and said, Volker, at this campaign, as the clients would spend, I don't know, let's say 250 grand a month on video, then, the ROI would go up. So, and I can model that. I can forecast that. And in most companies, if I say most analysts would just sit there and do that and maybe mention it to the account manager. But at Rocketfuel was like, okay, what can we get the client to spend, right? And how can we prove that there is an ROI at the end? So not like we have, spends a little bit and we see what happens. And we built out all these models, call it data-driven sales. Maybe I should trademark. But that's the interesting bit. And that's where I fell in love with this whole revenue insights as well, right? Because it's a data-driven sales, right? What is working, what isn't working? The data is there rather than just going out and sell, right? So if you take a bit more of a methodological approach, an analytical approach, and look at the data, there's so much more you can do. And that's why I enjoyed that. And, that's why, I like to sit across sales, marketing and client success for start and scale ups as well, because you can bring it all together. I mean, if anyone here knows the winning by design, models, around the bow tie model, it's not rocket science and, no offense here to Jacko, but it's someone needs to point it out. And I think the winning by design came at the right time saying, guys, from a SaaS model, you need to think about that because a lot of people know about it, but they don't formalize it. They don't look at the data. And that's what these guys are doing really, really well. And that's where this whole space, I think, is taking off now because we finally start looking at data and treating sales as a proper job rather than just a function that's needing to bring in revenue.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's become much more important over the last 6 to 9 months as well, in that consulting sales approach, as well as being data driven. It's been much harder to push for budget in general without having that approach because you need to outline ROI clearly before you can even get there, right? I was chatting to the CEO of the Carabiner Group, Seamus Ruiz Earl, and their consultancy firm based out in San Francisco Bay Area, all to do with RevOps.
Yeah.
And he was saying that more often than not, all of these functions, the go-to-market function, both marketing, sales, RevOps, I mean, it all ties into one and it should act as one.
Yeah.
And I think people forget that sometimes.
I mean, it's a funny thing with RevOps, right? Because I had a sales ops manager back in the days, how long ago, 13, 14 years ago. And she was fantastic, right? I mean, essentially she did deal desk sales ops and what we would now call RevOps. And then later on I had deal desks, somewhere else, but I didn't have sales ops. And, RevOps kind of like, I don't know who came up with that term, but it kind of brings it all together. It's almost like a mini CRO, right? That does the data in the background, goes to the CRO and says, this is what we need to do. and, like almost like a PA to the CRO and say, these are the things we need to do, here's the data. Um, and yeah, I don't know why it took so long for us to come up with that. Right. I mean, I know some of the companies have been around for 10 odd years, but I think it probably has to do with, I say the macroeconomic situation that people go like, we need to start looking at the data where we can improve things and what we need to do in order to move forward.
I completely agree. And I think that software in general and the SaaS industry, I think, is forward thinking in many respects, albeit still somewhat behind in its conception of RevOps and using RevOps correctly. Yet when you think of, like, I guess, other industries, it's an untapped function of the business. So I think there's a lot of room for growth there. Changing topic here. The last question I had for you, Volker, is actually a question from our previous guest. CEO and founder of UHubs, which is a sales coaching and training platform, which I think is going to be appropriate for your background, Matt Milligan.
Okay.
And he asked you, what does the role of a sales leader look like 5 years from now, given how quickly AI is changing?
Yeah. Oh, it's a fair. I have no idea where I'm going to be in 5 years' time, right? It's a good question, and AI it's another interesting question, right? So several thoughts that spring to mind because I work with a few companies that are in the AI space, and there was an interesting video earlier on LinkedIn about that people are asking for frameworks around AI and principles, so we don't misuse it, right? So we use it ethically, so we don't have the Terminator scenario. And I think what AI does, and again, I don't know Matt's platform, so maybe I should reach out to him. But there are a lot of AI platforms, revenue intelligence platforms coming out that are focusing on coaching based on AI. So a friend of mine developed an AI that essentially gives you a mini podcast on your way to work, right, or on your morning commute, right, as far as we commute still, which kind of just summarizes, go like, I don't know, call Mrs. Smith because you haven't called her for the last, 8 days. And, I think she could do with a bit of a push, to get that deal over the line. Right. And your pipeline looks a little bit thin. Maybe you do 2 hours of outreach today and things like that. It gives you these little nuggets. And I think it's fantastic. And obviously it's all based on AI. And I'm constantly speaking to platforms and some are really, really clever around that. So in that sense, to answer Matt's question, I think in 5 years' time, we might have automated the focus of this world, right? From a sales coaching perspective. Although I think, there's still a human factor to consider. But we're going to get more and more insights, right? And more guidance in terms of, what do we need to coach people on? Where do people need help? And potentially complete analysis of, if I say, where are the deals? So let's say you put a deal in, and if I say 3 weeks down the line, depending how you've worked it, the AI might tell you, don't bother with that deal. It's never going to close because they have the foresight and they have enough data to compare to. Should we believe them? I don't know. It's the other question. What if someone hacks into that AI from a competitor and says, don't worry about that deal because we got it covered over here. So, AI is a big buzzword and, it's been around for years. So I'm not concerned, it will take over certain jobs. I mean, of course it will. As technology changes, it also creates lots of jobs, right? I mean, as I always say to my kids, right? When they say, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do for a living. And I'm like, you're 12, you're 14, right? You don't have to worry about it too much. But some of the jobs you might want to be doing don't exist. So don't worry about it, right? I mean, there's no point of worrying about it. Let's see what have a traditional, I don't know, doctor, teacher, architect job, which, would still be around. And sales will always be around, right? I don't think you can automate sales but you can support sales better. And I'm sure AI will play a big role there.
Completely agree. And I mean, it goes back to the conversation that we were having earlier about EQ. I mean, there is so much insight I think AI is going to bring, obviously, to a sales leader and a sales team to act upon if it's used correctly. But there is that element, that human element, as you mentioned, that EQ, that's just, I'm unsure of how that's going to play out in the future. I think there will always be a role for a sales leader because of that.
No, I agree. It's a human factor, right? That's what it is.
Well, it's sales is, isn't it? So it's relationships. To
Yes.
meet people, it's having a pint. If only if it was easy as that. But Volker, those were all of the questions I had for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. For anyone listening or watching this podcast, we're going to have a bunch of links to Volker's newsletter, Ballueder Partners, and any other bits and bobs that might be relevant. Volker, before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to leave the audience with? Any final parts of words?
Oh, I not if I say not really. I mean, if you want to find out more, just get in touch with me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest, and to all the sales people out there, it's all about, it's about your mindset, right? That's key. And, that helps the mind, right? I keep saying it for many years. So I have a meditation practice for over 15 years, and, it helps me to stay sane, literally. And I think whatever your meditation practice might be, it's so important to be grounded. And, having self-awareness is so key in terms of noticing, when you get stressed, when you get overworked, when do you go down on this downward spiral, when do you start having limiting beliefs and tell yourself the wrong stories. And that's just something I think to cultivate, or as Pascal Finette in my podcast, as I said earlier, said, focus on the positive sparks to really move forward and push yourself to always better yourself, day by day, one step at a time.
Fantastic words. Fantastic. Volker, it's been an absolute pleasure. And to all those listening, we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Thank you, Freddie. Cheers.